Everybody for being here today. We are all aware of what the world thinks about Canadian oil sands industry, and Canadians are divided on the issue as well. Is the Canadian oil sands industry an unethical and ravenous corporate monster, or is it a highly regulated world leader in energy production and a holistic business plan? Can we measure the industry's ethical behavior in a critical, holistic manner, or should we focus on the analysis on key social issues? Mr. Levant explores these questions in his book, Ethical Oil, The Case for Canadian Oil Sands. He's a lawyer, journalist, and an activist who has become a key player in the debate on Canada's oil sands industry. He has been featured on BNN, CBC, Fox News, and in many newspapers across Canada. Mr. Levant is the first in a series of SIFE-sponsored speakers to address the Mount Royal student body on the Canadian oil sands industry. At Mount Royal University, we encourage the discussion and exchange of different views on the world around us. In order for us to critically analyze social issues and develop their solutions, we must be aware of all sides and all factors. It is by this exposure that we can strive to be our nation's future leaders. It is with great respect that I, the Mount Royal faculty, and the members of SIFE, Students of Free Enterprise, welcome Mr. Levant to our fine campus. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Levant.
Thanks very much, everybody. Great to be here. Calling me Mr. Levant is so distracting because I keep looking around for my dad. I don't think he's here today, so I'm just going to fill in. Before I start, can I take a bit of an informal survey? You don't have to participate if you don't want, but I just want to know where folks stand. Who here thinks that we should slow down the oil sands or at least stop expanding them? Anybody? Okay, a couple of hands. That's great. Who thinks that we should shut down the oil sands, like literally stop what we've got going on right now? Anybody? No? Who thinks we should actually increase the oil sands and produce more? Okay, there's a few hands. Fair enough. I'll try and remember to check at the end of my talk to see if I've switched anywhere. Hopefully I won't switch people from grow to stop. Listen, I'm a conservative guy, I'm a right-wing guy, I'm a property rights guy, I'm a Kyoto skeptic. But funny enough, those arguments don't seem to persuade people who are critical of the oil sands. They just don't. And I think it's because we're having two different discussions. Oil sands critics, I think, are generally well-meaning, idealistic liberals. And making the case for the oil sands through traditional conservative arguments just doesn't work. It's like speaking a different language. But I think that if you truly take oil sands critics at their word and actually listen to what they're really saying, is they're trying to do good. They're trying to do the right thing. They're not malicious people. They're not Alberta haters. They're not even oil haters necessarily. I'm excluding, for the purposes of the discussion, professional activists like people who work for Greenpeace. You'll never change their mind. But 90% of the people who are critical of the oil sands do so because they think it's the right thing to do. Let me give you an example. If someone, and I'm just going to, let's say her name is Zoe. She's 21. She's a student at McGill University in Montreal. She's taking vegetarian studies. And she's hostile to the oil sands. Well, why? Is it because she hates the oil sands? No. She's likely never been out here. I mean, who from Montreal? What 21-year-old student's ever going to go out for a No one. And what does she hear every day? She hears news, or opinions, or information, or disinformation about the oil sands, and being a good person who wants to improve the world, she naturally comes to dislike the oil sands. And she's not doing so out of anger, she's doing it out of love, actually. So I think the way to talk to a concerned liberal about the oil sands is not to say, for example, oh, you're worried about carbon dioxide and global warming? That Al Gore cult? Come on, you got to be deprogrammed. Don't you know it's just junk? Now, that may be my true point of view. But that is not going to turn Zoe around. In fact, all that will feel like is a personal attack on her values. And frankly, it is. But I don't have to tell Zoe that global warming is the subject of skepticism because I can actually count on her liberal values. Because if I show you, which is what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, Canada's oil sands are actually the most liberal oil industry in the world. We are the fair trade coffee of the world's oil industry. And let me now prove that using liberal arguments, not my old conservative ones, but ones specifically tailored for Zoe. What does Zoe care about? What do liberals care about? Why are they mad at the oil sands? Well, I can think of 4 things that liberals truly believe in. These aren't straw men, these aren't caricatures, these are what liberals believe. Number 1, liberals believe in a clean environment. Obviously. But not just real pollution like smoke or dirty water, but carbon dioxide too. Now, when I was a kid, which I'm old enough to be your parents probably, but when I was a kid, carbon dioxide, we learned about it in school under photosynthesis. It was called plant food back then. But today people say it is the source of man-made global warming. Now I could dispute that, but I won't, and I'll show you why. I'll prove to you today that oil sands are the fuel of choice for global warming warriors. So that's the number 1 thing that's always worried about, is the environment, real pollution as well as carbon dioxide. But that's not the only thing that motivates liberals like Zoe. That's a very narrow bandwidth of what constitutes ethics, right? I mean, look at the word Greenpeace. There's the green part, but there's also the peace part. And I think that's a big part of being progressive or liberal. You believe in peace as opposed to conflict or war or terror, right? I think so. I mean, before your time, but in the 70s and 80s, before the Berlin Wall came down, the peace movement was enormous, the disarmament movement. And even today, post 9/11, I think peace is something that liberals truly value. Wouldn't you agree? But that's not it, because there's more to being a liberal, there's more to being a passionate idealist that cares about the world than just the environment and peace. I think a big part of the progressive movement is fair wages, respect for the working man. Liberals might use the phrase economic justice. The actual guy in the pit digging the oil, are you treating him right? Are you paying him well? That's the whole labor union movement. I think that is a genuine liberal value. How do you treat the working man or woman? And then the 4th liberal value that I know motivates Zoe, and frankly it's my personal priority out of these 4, is human rights. It's something we take for granted in Canada sometimes, but it's not normal around the world. How do you treat women? How do you treat minorities? How do you treat gays? How do you treat Aboriginals? How do you treat people who are weaker than you? That's what I call human rights. And I think that's something that motivates liberals in Canada and around the world. So those are my 4 liberal values. And they're not fake. Like, I'm not setting these up just to bash them down. I think the liberals would say, yeah, that's me. I believe in the environment. I'm worried about carbon dioxide. I believe in peace. I'm opposed to war. I believe in fair wages for the working man and woman. Fair trade, they could say. I believe in human rights. Good. Because Zoe, I'm not going to challenge your values. I'm not going to contradict your values. I'm not going to dispute your values. I'm not going to tell you to abandon your values. The opposite. I am counting on you to hold true to your values, because I can now show you on your own liberal terms, by your own yardsticks, that Canada's oil sands oil is morally superior than any other source of oil in the world. And that's the important distinction here. This is not a debate about the oil sands versus perfection. Some fuel that hasn't been invented yet, like the lithium crystals, that is just so perfect. There's no environmental side effects. Everyone can afford it, and it's great. When that is invented, let me know. But in the meantime, that should be at a science fiction convention like Comic-Con or something, where we can talk about how awesome it's going to be. But this week, 300 million Americans are going to fill up their car with gas, and that gas is coming from somewhere. And you cannot say windmills, or solar power, or biomass, or tidal. You cannot say that will provide Americans for gas for their cars, because it just doesn't. And guess what? That last year, for the first time ever, more Chinese cars were sold than American. More cars were sold in China than in America. And they all want to be 2-car families too. And India's close behind. And so it's not about oil for us. We're an exporter of oil, net exporter. We've got enough oil for ourselves. The question is the 300 million Americans and over 1 billion people in China, almost 1 billion in India. Where are they going to get their gasoline from? Because it's going to be gasoline for their cars, because we haven't invented, in Avatar, what were they mining? It was called unobtainium. Yeah, you're damn straight. That's what they called it. And pretty honest, right? And even that had some side effects, as you saw. Too many dead Smurfs. But my point is, if you want to be morally serious, if you want to be grown up in your discussion about making the world a better place, you cannot compare the oil sands to perfection, because that is not the test. Because if we were to shut down the oil sands tomorrow, and by the way, the oil sands really, it's all for the United States market. 1.4 million barrels every day is exported to the U.S. It's not for us, it's for them. Fine, shut it down. Do you think Americans will just stop driving their cars this week? No. Where did America buy its oil before the oil sands came on tap. They bought it from Saudi Arabia. In fact, until the year 2004, the number one source of oil imports to the United States was Saudi Arabia. We've pushed them out of top spot. We've taken their market share. It's not like America is buying 1.4 million barrels a day extra. They've displaced oil from bad guys. And when I say bad guys, bad isn't a strong enough word. If you look at the top 10 countries around the world ranked by oil reserves, and by oil reserves I mean how much is in the ground. It's a good way of predicting where oil is going to come from in 5, 10, 20, 50 years. I don't know what God was thinking when he was handing out oil, but boy, he gave it to all the bastards in the world. Saudi Arabia, the number one oil reserve country in the world. Other countries on that list, Iran, Russia, which is becoming a fascist state before our eyes. Places like Nigeria and Venezuela. In fact, Russia is sort of a democracy, really, yeah, maybe. Iraq is a wobbly democracy. They're on the list, and I wish them well. But really, other than that, we are the only true Western liberals on the list. We're Boy Scouts in a world full of terrorists. Let me talk about my second value, peace, for a second. We Canadians invented peacekeeping. It's a Canadian idea. The Saudis invented 9/11. 15 out of the 19 terrorists that day came from that country. Iran is using its oil revenues to build a nuclear bomb to threaten Israel and the West. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela is using his oil money to threaten Colombia and crack down on opposition newspapers and radio stations in his own country. Russia has used its oil money to rearm its military and to rebuild the successor agency to the KGB called the FSB. They invaded Georgia. I put it to you that none of these bad behaviors, none of this terrorism, none of this belligerence could happen if it were not for the oil revenues these countries receive. We're the good guys paying foreign aid to other countries, sending peacekeepers, while all the other oil countries are creating terror. Which is morally superior? I put it to you that oil sands oil and Saudi oil and Iranian oil and Sudanese oil all burn the same way in your gas tank. There's no difference. But there's a moral difference. You know what I'm talking about. A cup of coffee tastes the same whether or not it's fair trade. The difference is, did the farmer get paid more? Now, maybe you don't care about that. That's okay. Maybe the only thing you care about is price. I want the cheapest cup of coffee I can find. Taste doesn't even matter to me. Okay, fine. Good. Go to it. Yeah. But if you care a little bit about more than just the taste, the price of coffee, will you pay an extra quarter a cup for fair trade coffee? A lot of people do. In fact, there's a whole industry, isn't it, fair trade coffee? People pay $1 a glass more. Well, what about for fair trade oil? We are the only people in the world of any size producing oil ethically. Switzerland is not a great oil nation. I'm sorry, it's not. And that is not the alternative. If we were talking about olive oil, we would be comparing ourselves to countries like Greece and Italy, fellow democracies, liberal countries that we can get along with. But unfortunately, the alternative to oil sands oil is not pixie dust, it's not windmills, it's not solar power. Those haven't been invented yet. It is not oil from Switzerland. It is oil from the terrorists and dictators of the world. We've talked enough about peace, but before I go from this issue to the other three values, I tried to measure the ethics of oil in my book. It's tough to do. Like, how do you measure? Like, how do you put a number on ethics? Well, environmentalists will say pounds of CO2 per barrel. That's one measurement, right? The fewer pounds, the better. Okay, sure, fine. But how do you measure peace with a number? Here's one way. There was 230 ducks that landed in a tailings pond a couple of weeks ago in Fort McMurray. Did you hear about that? Of course you did. It was in all the news for a solid week. 230 ducks. I myself can go through 40 wings on wings night. And, for 230 ducks, over 100,000 ducks shot by good old boys in Alberta last year hunting. KFC sold 1 million double down sandwiches in the first month. Okay, but listen, we kill ducks on purpose, for food, on purpose, for hunting. But these 230 ducks died by accident. It was not on purpose, it was wasteful. It was embarrassing, it was an accident, it was regrettable, it was unfortunate. Yes, it was all these things. But I will not use the word tragedy, as some have done. And do you know why? Because I need to keep that word tragedy sharp, like a sharp knife that I don't use all the time. Because every once in a while, a real tragedy happens. And if I've used the word tragedy to talk about 230 dead ducks or a dead worm that I stepped on by accident, then what word do I have when Darfur in Sudan murders 300,000 people on purpose? Not an industrial accident like 230 ducks, but 300,000 men, women, and children. If I've used the word tragedy to describe 230 ducks, what word is left? Genocide? Okay, I'll use that one then. I took 300,000 people dead. That's a United Nations statistic. I multiplied it by 185 ounces of blood in every human body. And I divided that total amount of blood into the number of barrels of oil exported by Sudan over the same period of time. And it works out to 6.5 milliliters of blood in every damn barrel of oil from Sudan. How much blood is that? It'll fill up a lipstick tube. It's about as much blood as in your big thumb or your eyeball in every barrel of oil. So don't talk to me about dirty oil or criminal oil, as Greenpeace calls it. Let's talk about blood oil. There really is blood oil in the world. What's in your gas tank? Because if you're not buying it from Alberta's oil sands, you were buying it from somewhere else. David Suzuki flies in jets powered not by vegetable oil, but by jet fuel made with oil from somewhere. Which is more? Oil from Sudan with 6.5 milliliters of Darfuri blood in every barrel, or oil from Alberta where accidentally 230 birds touched down in a tailings pond. And by the way, 2 years ago when 1,500 ducks died once in a tailings pond, that's sort of lunchtime in Chinatown, Peking duck. They paid $3 million in fines. That's $2,000 a duck. Criminal charges. You know, when Russell Williams, the serial murderer and rapist out east, was convicted, he had to pay his 88 victims $100 each. Murder victims, rape victims, they got $100 each from Russell Williams, but these 1,600 ducks that Syncrude murdered, and I use the word murder because it was a criminal code charge, wasn't it? They were paid $2,000. I tell you that our moral code is out of whack when we care more about Wings Night than we care about Darfur or Russell Williams victims. I am not saying I'm happy that 230 ducks died by accident. I am just saying that if that is our moral test, we live in a very Alice in Wonderland world. The world is not like Canada. I agree with Chapters. The world needs more Canada. We need more Canadian oil and less Saudi oil. Let's talk about, I'll come to environment last because that's the biggest one. I talked about peace. Now let's talk about this other liberal value of economic justice, or fair wage for the working man. As you all know, being Albertans, Fort McMurray is the richest, highest income city in Canada. It just is. According to the United Way, it's also the most generous city in Canada. That makes me even more proud. Doesn't it make you more proud? How about the fact that if you are the working poor, and by this I mean the lowest quarter of income earners, if you are the working poor in Canada, get thee to Fort McMurray. Because although the cost of living in Fort McMurray is higher, you will earn so much more at your entry-level jobs. Your purchasing power, that is, once you take into account the higher cost of living, is actually 77% higher for the working poor. They're 77% higher. They can buy 77% more in Fort McMurray than in comparable cities like Edmonton. That's amazing to me. You can drive a pickup truck, high school degree. Forget about your fancy university degrees. Get yourself, you don't even need high school. Get yourself a driver's license. Show up sober, get behind a wheel, and make $100 grand a year. Tell me somewhere else where you can do that. How about Nigeria? Can you do that in Nigeria? Nigeria is one of the poorest countries in the world. Life expectancy is 47. Oh my God, I'd have like 9 years left to live. 1 out of every 2 Nigerians lives on less than $1 a day. Yet Nigeria has one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and they've been pumping it full tilt for 50 years. Where did all the money go? Like, how can you be one of the largest producers of oil in the world for 50 years, and the largest recipient of foreign aid in the world, and yet be so poor? That takes some strategizing, doesn't it? Well, yeah, or just corruption. The Nigerian government's own internal corruption commission reports that $366 billion, that's with a B, has been stolen from that country since 1960. It works out to $18 a barrel for every barrel ever produced. So not only is the money not going to the people on the ground, it's going to the kleptocrats, the dictators. Sani Abacha himself stole $5 billion. It's all in the Swiss banks. Compare that to the treatment of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the only country I know of named after a family that owns it. The Saudi royal family, they sit about in their golden palaces in the desert. The work isn't done by Saudis. It's done by migrant workers, Palestinians, people from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Thailand. No rights, no citizenship rights, no legal rights. They're lucky to take home a pittance of what they earn. It's migrant abused laborers who are working in Saudi Arabian oil fields. We Canadians pay our oil people, I'm talking about the people on the ground, better than anyone else in the world. But how about my final value of human rights? I'm going to come back to the environment. How about human rights? We take it for granted. We take it for granted. The mayor of Fort McMurray is a young woman named Melissa Blake. Completely unremarkable in Canada to have a young woman mayor, isn't it? I mean, seriously, we elected Nellie McClung almost 100 years ago now. I mean, the famous five, they're all Alberta troublemaking women. And we've got a history of troublemaking women in this province, don't we? We've had a woman prime minister, we've had 2 women governors general. I mean, welcome to normal. It's like the wallpaper. We don't even notice it anymore. I got a question for you. How many young women mayors are there in Saudi Arabia? Anybody? 0, that's right. It's against the law to be a young woman mayor in Saudi Arabia. It's against the law to vote if you're a young woman in Saudi Arabia. It is against the law to drive if you're a young woman in Saudi Arabia. It is against the law to get elective medical care in Saudi Arabia without your husband's permission, written permission, because you're just a woman. Now that sounds insane, but that is how they live. It's worse next door in Iran, where Sharia law is the law of the land. Mayor Blake happens to be divorced and is engaged to her fiancé living with him now, completely normal in Canada. Under Sharia law, that is called adultery. And she would be stoned to death merely for being who she is. And if you think that's just some old parchment that's never enforced, then you're not following the news. They stone women to death in 2010 in Iran. And if you're gay, Lord help you, they will literally crucify you. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was asked when he went to Columbia University about gay rights in Iran. Remember that? And he answered, there are no gays in Iran. Do you remember that? And the crowd at Columbia sort of laughed nervously. But he wasn't lying, actually. There are no gays in Iran. Because if he finds them, he kills them. Would you rather have that in your gas tank than some oil that killed 230 ducks? You tell me what the ethical oil is. Aboriginals, how are they treated in Venezuela by Hugo Chavez, who himself has Aboriginal blood in him? If they get in his way, he pushes them away. If they resist, he murders them. Don't take it from Halliburton. Don't take it from George W. Bush. Take it from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Hugo Chavez doesn't give a damn about Aboriginal people. Contrast that to our oil sands, the largest employer of Aboriginal people in Canada. And not fake work, make work projects, but real jobs, breaking the cycle of dependency forced upon them by the Indian Act and other historical unfairnesses. Here we have an industry that says show up for work, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you can make 6 figures. And now the oil sands have been around so long, fathers go to work there and now their sons do. Talk about breaking that cycle of poverty and dependency. I am so enormously proud of how the oil sands treat Aboriginal people. And I don't quite want lectures from other parts of this own country where their solution to the Aboriginal problem was to kill them all, not solve things. Okay, but how about the tough one? How about the environment? You know, the oil sands, it's true, are geographically as big as the state of Florida. That's pretty big. And have you seen those pictures? I call them oil sands porn. Those graphic open pit mines. Looks like something on the land of Mordor and Lord of the Rings. I think there's some orcs running around down there. They're ugly. They're awful. Absolutely they are. All open pit mines are pretty ugly. The good news is, and you never hear this when you get the oil sands porn in your Greenpeace fundraising letter, is that those open pit mines, they only constitute 2% of all the oil sands geography, because only 2% of that land area are the oil sands close enough to the surface that you can mine them with an open pit mine. In the other 98% of the land, the oil sands are so deep, you can't just dig it all up. You have to put a pipe down there. It's called in situ, or in site, or in place, and steam it out. The pipe goes down deep, maybe a quarter mile, steams the oil, pumps it out on top, forests, birds, critters frolicking, Bambi. Unfortunately, that doesn't make for as effective fundraising for Greenpeace. And here's another difference. If you're from other parts of the world, or even other parts of the country, you know that open pit mines, that's how it's done. Nickel, copper, asbestos, whatever. Here in Alberta, we do something they really don't do anywhere else. We reclaim it. They have to leave the land as pristine as they found it. They have to replant the native soils and trees and grasses. And they've reclaimed over 60 square kilometers. 60 square kilometers have been reclaimed already. There's bison herds up there. Again, geographically and culturally appropriate. Funny how we don't see those on TV every night. Maybe it just contradicts the official narrative about the oil sands being terrible. Well, how about the water? How about how we're using up all the water in the Athabasca River? Yeah, really? Only 2% of the mighty Athabasca is allotted to the oil sands. And of that 2%, only 1% is actually used. And of that 1%, even that is reduced in periods of low flow. Compare that to the Bow River. I can assure you, I don't know the statistics for the Bow River. I know the statistics for other rivers, like the Colorado River. In some parts, over 100% of the river's flow is allotted. I don't know quite how they do that. But that's, to say that the Athabasca River is in jeopardy of being pumped dry is just absurd. But it relies on the fact that Zoe McGill, who's heard about things on TV or in a Greenpeace letter, will never see for herself. And she probably doesn't know that the air quality in Fort McMurray, including right over the factories, is better than the air quality in Montreal. Well, how can that be? Well, Fort McMurray doesn't have 1 million cars on the street, like Zoe's hometown does. Well, what other environmental issues can we do? Well, I want to talk about a small thing you can do when you talk about oil sands. When I started writing this book, the very first thing I did was look up the word tar in the dictionary. Because I had heard people say tar sands, and I had heard people say oil sands, and I didn't know which was which. I knew tar sounded a little dirtier, a little messier, a little more toxic. And so I could sort of tell the people who were critical said tar sands, and people who were supporters of oil sands. I looked up the word tar. Does anyone know where tar comes from? There's coal tar, that's one source of tar. But even before that, where was tar from? There's another kind of tar. It's from pine trees, actually. Pine tree roots, to be more specific. The British Navy used tar, pine tar, you've probably heard the phrase, to waterproof their boats. Now, I've been up in the oil sands. There's no pine trees under the ground there. It's not coal, it's oil. It's oil mixed with sand and clay and water. If you want to be technical about it, you can call it bitumen, which is what its geological name is. But if you want to be plain and simple, you can call it oil sands. There's no tar in it. And I say this, and I look back historically, the companies going back to the 1920s either called themselves oil sands or bitumen companies. They never called themselves tar sands companies. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying tar sands other than it's not accurate. But you can tell, it's like a poker tell. It's like a giveaway when someone's bluffing. If someone who should know better says tar sands, instantly that's your giveaway. But they're just going to embroider the truth just a little bit, just to see what they can get away with. They'll test you to see if you know better. And if you don't, they might pass a few fast ones by you. Like, for example, telling you the whole thing's going to be mined, when in fact only 2% will be. Water use. Let's talk about that for a minute. The in situ, that's the underground ways of getting the oil out of the ground. The most common way right now is called SAGD. That stands for Steam Assisted Gravity Drainage. They pump the steam in, melt the oil out of the sand, and pull it up, drain it. That doesn't use any river water at all. It uses naturally occurring underground water, non-potable water, recycled 90%. And then I was up at White Sands for the pepper bank TIE project, that stands for air injection, total air injection. They don't use water at all. They have an underground combustion, and they pull the oil up partly refined. The new technologies used by the oil sands have a smaller environmental footprint than the older technology, like the open pit mines. So much so that over the last 20 years, from 1990 to today, the amount of carbon dioxide per barrel from the oil sands has fallen by 38%. We're 38% lower in our carbon emissions per barrel today than we were 20 years ago. I can hardly wait to see where we're going to be in 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. And that's that natural Canadian self-criticism, self-improvement. How can we do better? And I can tell you, it's not because Greenpeace was putting out press releases. It was companies saying, well, how can we be more efficient? How can we save money? How can we do it with less energy use? 38% less emissions per barrel today than 1990. And that's when I remember when I said, when Zoe is very, very, very worried about global warming, very worried about carbon dioxide, you can tell her beliefs don't matter. You can deny and refute and disparage her values, and that's actually my natural tendency. But if I actually wanted to convince Zoe to support the oil sands, I would say, Zoe, guess what? I am so glad we have had this talk about global warming because there's something I need your help with right now. Did you know that the United States imports oil from Nigeria and Venezuela and Iraq and produces oil in California, all of which have a higher carbon content per barrel than oil sands oil? Now, why is it that Nigerian or Iraqi oil would have a higher carbon footprint? Well, because they flare all their natural gas. When we get natural gas coming up with the oil, we catch it and sell it or burn it in cogeneration. We're efficient, and we don't want to waste that money. Nigeria just burns $2 billion worth of natural gas a year. So much flare you can see it from space at night. Who would do that? Well, someone who doesn't care about the environment. In Nigeria, there are 2,000 unremediated toxic oil spills that will never be cleaned up. Flaring gas, they don't care. But that flaring gas